Herbert Hoover is a name that, well, lives in infamy in America. It's forever tied to a stubborn, detached leader who is unable to combat the worst economic calamity in the nation's history. In Belgium, however, Hoover is synonymous with hero, a stubborn, detached leader who kept millions of Belgians from starving during their country's darkest hour. It was a century ago, on October 22nd, 1914, that the newly minted Commission for Relief in Belgium, or the CRB, headed by the future US president, embarked on an urgent and unparalleled humanitarian relief effort. When German forces stormed the independent Kingdom of Belgium in August of 1914, they destroyed all the prosperous nation's villages and factories and seized the land and livestock for the invading troops. By October, with the Germans refusing to feed the besieged civilians and Great Britain's naval blockade choking off imports to a country that relied on them for 70% of its food, the situation was beyond dire. And so began what remains the most impressive philanthropic undertaking in history, the US led effort to save an entire nation in the midst of war from almost certain starvation. Welcome to the History Buff, short snippets of history which are odd or lesser known, and I try to keep videos at 5 to 7 minutes long, just enough to keep your interest and that you can move forward with the rest of your day. If you do like the content, consider subscribing. And if you really do like the content, please consider getting on board with our Patreon account. Every dollar helps out with the channel. So thank you so much. Here's the rest of the video. The Belgium Relief Mission's organizing force and its lifeblood, the man whom thousands of unpaid volunteers would idolize as chief, was not a world leader or even a government official. He was a private US citizen, a Stanford-educated mining engineer and businessman living in London who is known for his short fuse and icy temperament. For the son of Iowa Quakers who had been orphaned at a young age, work had always been his life, and he had accumulated more than $40 million supervising mining projects across the globe. But Hoover was hungry to enter public life and get into the big game. He was preparing to enter the newspaper business in California when the war broke out in Europe. When thousands of his fellow countrymen were stranded in Europe at the start of the war, Hoover helped to organize a relief effort in London, and his remarkable efficiency in doing so made impressions on US officials. The CRB was backed quietly by a US government wishing to remain neutral in the conflict and was staffed mostly with American volunteers, including more than a dozen American Rhodes Scholars who interrupted their studies in Oxford to work for Hoover. But this was its own relief organization. It would become, as one British official put it, a practical state organized for benevolence, with Hoover at its helm. Even the astounding numbers accompanying Hoover's efforts cannot truly capture the scale of the endeavor and the magnitude of the competence required to pull it off. To sustain millions of Belgians on at least 1,800 calories, Hoover needed to raise $12 million a month, plus another $10 million to maintain the supply lines, including 50 cargo ships, 40 barges he needed to acquire to deliver tens of thousands of pounds of food from all over the world, rice from Rangoon, wheat from America, and beans from Manchuria. To do so, Hoover not only led an unprecedented marketing campaign to raise funds from private donors and millions of citizens, but also shook down governments on all sides of the conflict. The daring CRB chairman routinely placed large supply orders costing more than 5 times the cash on hand. He demanded railways, factories, and warehouses, and canal boats. He resuscitated several Belgian industries, such as the lace making, to keep the nation's economy afloat. But just as impressive as the sheer scale of the operation was the context in which it was accomplished. In order to get the food shipments through the U-boat and mine-infested English Channel and up the canals to Belgium, Hoover had to secure cooperation of the combatants. He likened the task to trying to feed a hungry kitten by means of a 40-foot bamboo pole, said kitten being confined in a barred cage with 2 hungry lions. The unflappable Hoover repeatedly met with both German and British representatives and for days on end deployed arguments, veiled threats, deception, and outright lies to cajole both governments into doing the right thing. He convinced the Germans that if Belgium starved, the outraged Americans would surely enter the war, and he convinced the British that if the Belgians starved, alienated America would surely remain alienated. True to his Quaker upbringing and rather joyless personality, Hoover remained distant and even avoiding encounters with the very Belgians he was helping. But time and again, as U-boats took down his ships and leaders like Winston Churchill berated him, Hoover persevered, and Belgian and later occupied France ate. Hoover's biographer said few Belgians and Frenchmen knew by how thin a margin they were rescued again and again from the lingering death of starvation. In almost 3 years, Hoover and the CRB delivered 2.5 million tons of food to Belgian and French tables, feeding up to 9 million people each day and every day. The entire effort cost nearly $1 billion, yet not a penny was lost to fraud. And since Hoover and his associates performed their Herculean labors for free, there was virtually no administration costs. These days, even the most efficient charities will spend up to about 20% of funds on overhead expenses. The CRB's total overhead came to 0.43%. At the conclusion of the war, the CRB even had a surplus of roughly $35 million, which it distributed to Belgian educational institutions. In the press, Hoover played down his crucial role in the effort, and his name was never mentioned in the German-censored Belgian media, but every man, woman, and child in Belgium knew who had saved them. After the war, King Albert named Hoover the one and still only friend of the Belgian people, and he was given a Belgian passport marked perpetual. Today, Hoover streets and squares and libraries dot the country. The CRB would serve as a model for all future relief efforts and organizations, but Hoover's mercurial nature and boorish reputation and poor communication skills would prove far less effective in shaping economic policy and helping shepherd the American people through their own hardships during the Great Depression. Still, by 1923, when Hoover had completed almost a decade of relief work with the CRB and other post-war organizations, over 80 million people, including thousands of Germans, had received food from sources that Hoover had administered. Now you know your history.